Have you seen her? Ain't she great? She's something you'll appreciate. I'm sure you understand just what I mean. Everybody, everywhere, is falling for her now. I'm speaking of the new Ford, and boy, it's sure a wow. Lay off, people, lay off, folks. None of your sarcastic jokes. Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie. Not a rattle, not a bit. Lizzie now has lots of it. Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie. There's everything inside her now except a kitchen sink, a mirror, and a powder puff, a shower basin.
Our next presenter, Mike Vaughn from Lincoln, Nebraska, is the technical editor for the Vintage Ford, and he's got some transmission stuff to share.
Yeah, we're going to talk about balancing transmission drums and doing some of the work that using some of the transmission drums that Dave makes to make our jobs a little bit easier in that. I also wanted to bring up another topic that I really didn't tell these guys I was going to do, and it just happens to be on coils, a question that I get, and it happens to be, this is a question that will be in the next issue of the Vintage Ford that I answered, but I had all this stuff on the bench. I said I might as well bring it while I had it, and we can do that as well. So it's a simple question: is how do I tell? The question I got was, how do I tell whether my capacitor in the Model T coil, ignition coil, is good or bad? And the way that I do it is fairly simple. It's using a analog multimeter, and it needs to be analog. The digital multimeter won't show this like an analog meter shows it. So it's fairly simple to do. What I set the meter to 10K ohms, to read 10K ohms. And you don't need to zero it, but get it so you can see the needle move. And simply on a coil that has not had a capacitor replaced, and probably I would say 95% of all the original coils, the original capacitors in them leak. And you just push one lead up here on this top contact, the other one to the bottom. And on this one you can see the, and then when you test it again, you have to switch the leads. But you'll see that this one, the needle jumps up and stays up. That shows a leaking capacitor. If the capacitor charges and discharges properly, the needle will go back to zero. Okay, so here's one that's leaking, and we'll test it again. And we see that the needle jumps up on the meter and stays up there. That's a leaking capacitor. Probably 95% of all Ford capacitors that I test leak like this one does. So to test one this one's been rebuilt, and the points are still on it, you need to insulate the points from each other just by slipping a piece of paper between the 2 points. Like that, so that they can't contact each other. And then you do the same test. And watch the needle. Now, the needle will jump and quickly return to zero on a good capacitor. It doesn't take very long. To test it again, I have to reverse the leads. There we go, just like that. So that's the way you test them. I'm not going to get into how you rebuild the coils and do all of that kind of thing, but if you have a coil that, number one, on a leaking capacitor, what we start to see most often is around the bottom of the box, you start to see tar leaking out. And what's happening as you drive, it'll work, it'll still create a spark, and you'll still be able to drive your car with a leaking capacitor for a time. But after a while, you're going to develop a miss because that's going to heat up. and it'll start to cause some problems internally. So your timing changes, and it'll start to melt that tar out of the bottom. How many of you have ever pulled a coil out of a coil box and there's a lot of tar in the bottom? It's actually caused a problem because this contact gets covered with tar and you can't get a good contact down there, so you're not making a complete circuit, and it's not going to spark, it's going to cause a miss. So that leaking capacitor is a problem because it will heat up over time, so it needs to be changed. There's a lot of vendors out there that are rebuilding coils, or several guys that are redoing it. They do a nice job. Or you can do it yourself. I have a video on ModelT-Tips.com that will show you exactly how to replace the capacitor in the coil and get it going again. So I just wanted to bring that up as a question I get frequently about coils. I just answered it in the Vintage Ford in the next issue, and I had it here, so I thought I'd bring it down. Any questions about that?
Mike, what do you got for meter set on ohms?
Yeah, 10K ohms.
Times what?
Times 10K.
Okay.
Yeah.
10,000 ohms.
So simple thing to do. Analog meter works. A digital meter won't show that. It won't work on a digital meter. So you have to use an analog meter to do that.
What's the microfarads on capacitor?
It's 0.47. Yeah. And the vendors, Langs was here. He sells the correct capacitors. There are capacitors out there that vendors have sold in the past that weren't correct. They need to be a film foil capacitor. They can't be metal mylar. The metal mylar capacitors will heat up and cause you some problems down the road. It has to be a film foil capacitor. Typically, there's been about three capacitors in recent years that you can get from the vendors that have been good quality. The new ones, the new capacitors that we've been getting have little shorter leads on them. The capacitors that up until a year or so ago had 2-inch leads on them, which made them pretty simple to tie into the coil. The shorter ones, they still work, but you have to do it a little differently than we had been doing it in the past to get them to tie in. But they're a little bit thicker, so you have to rearrange some stuff in the coil to get them to go in the box. The ones that we had up until a year or so ago, those capacitors would actually fit in the same spot as the old capacitor. So you took the old capacitor out, didn't have to remove very much of that tar, and solder the new one back in place, and then I always repot the tar. Was pretty simple to do, didn't take very long, but now I've got to take to get the new capacitors in, I've got to take not only the old capacitor out, I take that glass insulator out, and there's 2 little blocks of wood, sometimes 3 in there. You got to take those out and kind of rearrange things. I put the glass insulator back in between the secondary windings and then reverse the blocks. Instead of 2 blocks against the windings, now I got the glass against the windings. I put the blocks back in and then solder the capacitor in it and then repot it with tar. You have to remove a whole lot more tar, and it takes a lot more time. And one thing I've always said about rebuilding coils is patience is everything on them. You've got, if you think it's going too slow, you need to slow down. Because if you start to speed something up, you're going to mess something up. You'll put a hole in a secondary winding and ruin one of those wires or something, and then the coil's done. You're toast with it. So be patient with it. Take that tar out slowly. Dig it out. I use an old screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, to dig it out, and just take a little out at a time. It takes some time, but be patient with it, and you'll get it out where we can see it. We're going to talk a little bit about transmission drums and the importance of balancing a transmission drum. One of the things and the reason we do this is because the transmission drum were typically out of balance and when they were new. I don't think that was something Ford ever really concentrated on was balancing a drum, but the reason that you want them to be balanced is vibration robs horsepower. And we want to get as much horsepower as we can out of a Model T to be competitive on today's roads, just so you can get away with the stop sign. So if you can balance some things up and take some of those vibrations away, you're going to increase the power of your car. And every little thing you can do to help your Model T run a little better, a little more power, makes it so that you can be driving that car on the street and enjoy it a little more. If you can get away from a stop sign without 8 people honking the horn at you because you're moving too slow, you're doing pretty well. So that's what we're wanting to do. We want to get some more power out of our cars. We're fortunate in today's market with vendors like Lang's. We can purchase some products that help us do that. He's selling a lot of parts over there that are performance parts for Model Ts, high compression heads and that kind of thing. That all helps. We've got improved camshafts been made that will give us more power and get us away from a stop sign a little quicker. We've got these new transmission drums that Dave's making, and for the most part, they're pretty good. We might have to touch them up a little bit to get them to balance, but they're nothing like the old ones. So I'm going to show you now. This balancer happens to belong to Mike Bender. The one I have is one I made, and I didn't bring it. Mike's is a lot nicer. Makes this a little easier. Mine works. I built cones instead of these mandrels. I've got 2 cones that are balanced on a shaft, and I can put the drums on and just fit the cones into it and then balance. And I used, instead of these nice roller bearing steel wheels here, I used some wheels off of some inline roller skates and made a jig here, and it works fine. It rotates around. That's what I've used for years. But I asked Mike to bring his because it is nice, and I really would like to have one like this someday. So I want to show you a couple of things. One of the things we have a problem with probably more often than not is reverse drums. The reverse drums are probably the most problematic of any of the 3 drums in the transmission. And the reason, I believe, is they got used for more than just reverse. They're thinner made than the other drums are. And so they would get hot and develop cracks, typically in the webbing. This is one that I took out of an operating car, and it had cracks in it, and then I put it in my scrap iron pile, and I was asked to do this presentation, so I thought, well, I'll go get that one. I know it's cracked, and I picked it up out of the scrap iron pile, and it came apart in my hands. It wasn't going to last too much longer in the car, was it? And you can see on here that the rust had developed where that had cracked. So it had been cracked a long time there, and it was pretty close to busting as it was. Typically, however, when you're looking at a drum, I'll pass this one around, the crack may not be real visible, and it doesn't show up until, I usually don't see them until I clean them. I put them in a tank of solvent, clean all the heavy grease off, and then as they're drying, you'll see the solvent still in that crack. And so I'll pass this one around. You're going to see it. It'll, as that dried, don't wipe it down, just let it dry, let it air dry, and that solvent will still be in the cracks. And they'll show right up. So that's all I do to determine whether they've got a crack in them or not. And typically this one that I'm passing around is one, unless you're really looking for it, you're not going to see that crack. And I wouldn't put it back in a car. And like I say, the reverse drums are typically the most common, but the low drum will crack as well. The other problem that we have besides cracked drums, and sometimes they're cracked across the surface too, where the band rubs against it. And when that happens, it usually eats up your band pretty quick. And if you're driving a car and you're having to adjust your band real frequently, it's probably because you have a cracked drum. And that's just chewing up your band, and pretty soon your band's going to be lint around everything else in your engine. So that's what it's doing with it. The reverse drums, or the brake drums, I'm sorry, the brake drums, typically the biggest problem we have, especially with the narrow drums, is that the lugs where the clutch plates bite become really coarse. They get chewed up. And what happens a lot of times is this is one of the reasons that your car doesn't have a free neutral, is the clutch drums, the clutch discs in here, they stick because they're stuck in those grooves. And when you turn the car on, or if you're cranking it, hand cranking it, it runs you over because it's not in free neutral. So that's pretty dangerous once it gets to that point, and the drum needs to be replaced. I'll pass this drum around. You can take a look at it as well. It's a little bit dirty, so you might get your hands dirty, but look at those clutch lugs on there, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So it's nice when somebody like Dave Nolting comes along and makes a new transmission drum. Now his narrow drums are made a little bit differently than most of the narrow drums. They did, I think, 1 year Ford made a narrow drum that actually had a lug shoe like the 26.7s that fit over to replace that. I think in 25 they did it 1 year. And those drums, so these are made like that. So you can actually use the lug shoes that go over these that the vendors sell. They're very inexpensive. A couple dollars a piece, maybe something, I don't know. They're not very expensive. Put those on and you'll never get a grooved drum like the one that's going around. If they wear out, you just replace the lug shoe. But probably won't wear out in our lifetime with the lug shoe. So these new drums are really nice. Typically, I find that when I put them on the balancer, they balance up fairly easily. A lot of times they're balanced when I put them on, right from Dave. I don't have too many issues with them. I'm going to show you a couple of things. We're going to balance. We'll look at this one here. This is an engine. I think the owner of the engine's here. He sent it up to me. Here he is over here, Tom Kohler from Kansas City. He sent me an engine to rebuild for him. And his transmission I brought with me because it's a pretty good example of one that's pretty far out of balance. And a good reason, probably so far out of balance that I'm not even going to try to balance these drums. You can do it. Talking with Mike, he drills holes a lot of times in the webbing, and then we'll put a bolt through there and try to add weight to one side or the other. You can do that. But I think these are so far out, especially the low drum, that it's going to be pretty hard to do that. And we'll use his manual here. The wrong one, the other one. And we'll put it up on the balancer, and we'll hold it up here, and this is a static balancer, so the heavy side's going to go to the bottom as soon as I let go. And there it goes. And that one went pretty fast, so it's got a really heavy side to it.
That would be one that I wouldn't even try to attempt.
I'm not going to try to do this one either because it's just so far out of balance. It's going to create, I'm going to have to take off too much material on there, and it's going to make the drum too weak to do that. So I was talking with Mike, and he gave me an idea on where the metal's at on these. And this one here is pretty interesting. On this side, 180 degrees from the heavy side, if I take a micrometer and measure this, I got to have some eyes to see this, but it's saying about 338 on the mic, and we'll go to the shallow side, or go to the heavy side. We'll come exactly 180 degrees around, and go to this side, and the drum thickness over here is now at 422. You can't balance it. There's no way you can do that. It's so much thicker on that heavy side that you'll never get that balanced. Yeah, Mike thinks that it can be put in the lathe and cleaned up a little bit, take the heavy side off a little bit, but that doesn't always ring true. We found this out yesterday on this very same transmission when we put the reverse drum on and we measured it up. It's got a thin side and a thick side just like that low drum does. And it's pretty far out of balance too. So we got it at the low side. So now if I go to measure this one was really odd. This is totally opposite. We're at 335 on this side. We'll go 180 over, measure the opposite side, and now we're at 285. So why is the thin side going to the bottom? The weight's got to be in that webbing then. That webbing's got to be off because the surface is thinner on the heavy side than it is on the light side. So again, another good candidate just for replacement. I mean, you could probably get it to balance, but you're going to end up taking so much material out that you're really going to affect the integrity of the drum, and especially the reverse drum being one that is susceptible to being cracked in the first place. I don't know, percentage-wise, I take quite a few transmissions apart every year, and I would say at least half of the reverse drums that you run across have an issue. I'd say at least half, probably more than that. But reverse drums are commonly a problem. Low gear is probably the next. And then on the early narrow drums, the serration is a problem. So it's nice. Now I'm going to show you the difference. We put one of Dave's brand new drums on, and these are his new drums with new gears. And he's got new bushings in. Everything's new on these, a brand new drum. And this is how it came from his shop. So he did all the work on it, and it's ready to go back in the car when it comes from his shop and you have him do this extra work for you. So here we're going to put the low gear on. And it's a little bit out. We're going to have to do a little work on this. Probably it's got a heavy side, but it's not too bad. So you can see how nice his drums are right from his shop. Now I think if I put the reverse drum on, it was pretty close to balanced without doing anything to it. You can't get much better than that.
Pretty happy.
I'm not going to do anything with that drum. It's just right there. So that shows the quality of work that Dave's doing. And I highly recommend his products. They're fantastic. I don't typically make endorsements, but I will endorse these because they are good. And Dave's put a lot of time and effort into design on his drums and his gears. And he's talking about having better gears coming out now. So I really support Dave in what he's doing there. The other thing is it saves an engine builder a lot of time. When you can take a set of drums like this and just basically put them together and put them in the car and not have to spend a lot of time trying to take weight off or add weight to a transmission drum to get things to balance up. We try to balance everything. When I build an engine, I know Mike does, we go through everything from rods and pistons and try to balance everything as good as we can to take as much of the vibration out of that engine as you can. Again, because vibration robs horsepower. So that's where we're going with that. Any questions on these balancing drums and the importance of doing that? Now, because when you add the heat to that drum, you're going to make it want to expand and contract, and when it does that, it's going to crack it.
The bushings that go inside the drums, are they supposed to be like from end to end, or can you cut them in half?
That's a good question. I built an engine for less. Let's just ask the question. I built an engine for less a year or so ago, and we took his transmission apart, and it had been rebuilt by somebody in the past. And these bushings that were in his transmission were cut in, well, they weren't even cut in half. The reverse drum was half a bushing that was pushed in there, and it was flush with this side. And then they expected the gears to hold the other up, and it probably did for a few miles. Probably did hold things up, but then it got to where it wore that bushing, and then it got to where it wore out the gears, and you could take and wobble that on the shaft about like that. And it was horrible, wasn't it, Les? It was in terrible shape. And it was wasn't just the reverse drum, it was all of them. I don't know why they did that, but it really hurt his checkbook because he had to buy a whole new transmission.
Since we're talking about the bushings, are the bushings typically wore out that you need to replace them, or are a lot of the bushings okay the way they come out of the car?
That's another good question. I would say 90% of the bushings that are in the car are still good. Triple gear bushings are the ones that wear out, but the transmission drum bushings typically don't wear out. I typically don't replace very many of them. The drive plate and brake drum bushings over here, typically you need to replace those, but the ones in these drums here, usually not much wear on them. And that was partly because these things run in oil that stay lubricated. So, as the piece I'm passing around here, you see there's still quite a bit of oil in the thing, and I've had it in the tank, cleaned it a little bit. So they get oiled, and they stay lubricated. But these bushings in here wear because they're out on the end, and things wear on these bushings a little bit more than they do on these others. So I run Kevlar on everything. There's guys that argue that, but I'll tell you, if you drive your car like you're supposed to drive your car, the Kevlar will last forever. And once you get them adjusted, you very rarely, if ever, have to adjust them in. When you put the new Kevlar bands on, you will need to adjust them once or twice, almost immediately after you put them in. It seems like you get everything adjusted up and you start the car up and you drive it around the block, it's going to be out of adjustment. They get seated in there. Once you get them seated in, get them locked down, I can drive thousands of miles in a Model T and never have to adjust them again. The problem that you're going to have is if you've got drums that are worn out or cracked, if you've got like the one that we're passing around with a crack that you can't see, and you put that back in there, the Kevlar bands will create a little more heat on your drums. They're going to do it. And if that's going to make that problem worse on a drum that's already cracked, and it could explode on you in the car, and that's happened. The other thing that is driver error. Guys that keep their foot on that pedal, on that clutch pedal, and ride that clutch just a little bit, and keeping that band against the drum, creating friction and creating heat, is going to be a problem. The other thing that can be a problem is using the reverse drum as a brake with Kevlar. It's just not going to hold up to that. So, but I recommend Kevlar. You get them adjusted. They work great, especially the brake. I can lock up my Model T with no external brake of any other kind on it. I drive with the regular transmission brake, and I can lock those wheels up with that Kevlar band on there. And you can't stop much better than that, the Model T. If your wheels aren't turning, that's as good as they're going to stop. So I highly recommend those. I've had some others, engines that I've put together for folks over the years. A guy had me put wood bands in, and I got the engine back a year later, said, hey, I was trying to change those wood bands out. I was going to put Kevlar in, and I dropped a nut down. Can you find the nut? Plus, while you're in there, put some Kevlar on for me. The wood bands chattered on him. He hated that chatter. He could never get rid of it. I tried to persuade him to put Kevlar in when we built it, and he was determined to put the wood in, so I put it in for him. He was paying for it, so that's what he got. And then he sent me the engine back, and the engine came from Wisconsin, so it wasn't a cheap adventure for him to have to bring it to Lincoln and have me build the engine and then have to bring it back to Lincoln to change it again, because he dropped one of the nuts down in there, and he wouldn't run it after that. He wanted me to find the nut. Yes. Lang's has them. I don't think you're going to be happy with the price. The price has gone up about 75% in the last couple of years. They've gone up from about $100 for the wide drum set to about $175 for the wide drum set. We still have to be thankful that the stuff's available. It's out there, and even though it's costing us more money, if you want to enjoy this hobby, you're just going to have to dig deep and enjoy it. It makes it hard on guys like me and Mike that somebody brings us something to build for them, and we quote them a price on something, and then we go to order the parts, and they've gone up 75% in price since the quote we gave them. But we pass it, and that's got to be passed on to you. So it's going to happen. Now, there are a lot of things that are higher in price. Just in the last couple of years, I don't know if COVID caused it or what caused it, but things have gone. Tires about doubled in price. If you go to buy a tire that you used to be able to get for $105 a piece, now they're $210 a piece. Cam bearings have gone crazy.
About 25 now.
His copper head gaskets have gone from $35 to $69. So prices are up, and that's just the way that it is. The quality bushings that we use in the triple gears, those bushings are about $28 each, and you use 3 of them in each transmission for the quality ones. That's a good question. Mike brought it up, that one of the reasons that Kevlar bands are a problem, or are blamed for a problem, is because number one, I think the pedal notches, the pedal cams in the hogshead are wore out, and so those pedals remain down essentially and keep pressure on the drum all the time. That also brings up another point, that there's different springs out there the vendors are selling for the pedal springs, and buy the best quality one. It's a little longer spring, puts more pressure on there. It pushes that pedal back up and gets that pressure off of that drum, and that's good whether you're running cotton bands or whether you're running Kevlar bands. You don't want that friction. And wearing those cotton bands are going to wear out a whole lot faster if you can't get them off the drum to start with. And the Kevlar bands are going to create heat and friction. So you want those pedal cams to be good. And then adjustment, simple adjustment. And this is the way my dad taught me how to adjust Model T pedals. You hear stuff all the time, oh, it's got to be so many half an inch from the floorboard or whatever. That's not it. That cam, use that cam. It's got to travel half the distance of that cam. Push it all the way down, it should have traveled half the distance of that cam. And then when you release it, it comes fully back. If you go half the distance of the cam, release, and fully back. And just look at the cams. All three pedals have a cam. The clutch pedal's on the inside of the hogshead. The other two are on the outside. But check that half distance. And it's not going to be an inch from the floorboard. You're going to be up. You're going to be up. And then when you do that release, look at the band and make sure it's releasing off the drum. Watch that. You probably, if it's not releasing off the drum, and you've got good cams, it's that spring is not pushing that pedal clear back far enough. The other thing is the hole in the hogshead itself where the pedal shaft goes through can be worn, or the shaft is worn. Either way, and the pedal shaft is not right. They get egg-shaped is what happens, and so they're not perfectly round. So those are all issues that can cause it. But the Kevlar bands themselves, when everything's set up right, there's guys in this room that have driven Model Ts thousands and thousands and thousands of miles with Kevlar bands and never had an issue.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Okay.
Like 80s Irish rose, Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie. The Chevrolet said with regret to the whippet, we're both wet. Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie. The Packard shouted to the moon,